And thank you for joining us here on PM Express. Well, over the weekend, the president gave a speech when he was awarded an honorary doctorate at the University of Cape Coast in the Central Region on the culture of silence. A very interesting speech indeed. I'll play you an excerpt when we sit down to have the conversation. But we cannot help but look at that because it comes in the wake of this conversation that we've been having in the last few months. Notably, Jonah really triggered it when he really also did his own public speech on the matter and put it out there front and center. So tonight we'll ask the question, is this whole culture of silence conversation perceived or real? We'll come to that shortly. We'll try and answer that for you tonight. So this is the president over the weekend speaking in the Central Region when he was awarded a doctorate. He was emphatic on the point that there is no culture of silence. Now, the thing about this speech that was also very fascinating was that Mr. Jonah, who had brought the issue up into prominence, but remember, the culture of silence conversation has been going on for a while. Many have suggested it and alleged. But when he gave that speech, I'm talking about Sir Jonah, gave that speech, it sort of put it front and center for national discussion. And at this event, Jonah was right next to the president. In fact, was sitting at the same stage as the president. And the president decided to take on the matter. A pretty fascinating contest indeed, as far as this is concerned. So what did the president say? The president insists that he is the most vilified political figure of his generation. And so if he is, how can a man, and this is the president's own question, how can a man who is the most vilified political figure of his generation be presiding over a culture of silence? Is the question that he asks. And tonight we'll also pose that question. First of all, is it true that he is indeed the most vilified political figure of his generation? We'll answer that question. But that's not all he said. According to the president, there is no hunt in Ghana that, for authors of dissenting views. And the way he put it, that there'll be no knock, there'll be no midnight knock on the doors of people who hold authors of dissenting views. That will not happen, not under his watch. That is the president's definitive pronouncement on the matter of cultural silence, which indeed is one of those terms that came into prominence in the 1980s under the PNDC era under, Jerry John Rawlings. There's many books I've been writing about this by members of the press. Some of them had to flee this country because they felt their lives were in danger because they're writing something critical of the president then, of course, the chairman then. The president says that will not happen under his tenure. Of course, I told you about Jonah. This was Jonah. What was Jonah's argument? And the two men were sitting on the same stage, right? One on the opposing side. We've heard the president's case. But Jonah's case was that there is a culture of silence, that the culture of silence is back. What was his argument? He says there's molestation and in some cases assassination of journalists. A case in point, Ahmed Swale. The president spoke about that directly. And some points during the speech, he would turn and look at Jonah and address the issue. But the president made a point about Swale that, listen, there's no suggestion that the government played a role in his assassination, but he also assured that his killers, his murderers, will be found and prosecuted and jailed. Bold statements. We'll try and speak to some of our guests about that pronouncement. He also talks about the murder of an MP, and that is true. An MP was murdered. He also raised the issue of corruption, right? He also talks about harassment of anti-corruption agents as all evidence or manifestation of this culture of silence that he believes exists. He says those who used to have voices on these things seem to have lost their voices. That is Jonah's argument. Now look at the definition of the culture of silence. It also includes the unspoken agreement to be silent on issues that you previously would have spoken on. In fact, the culture of silence, there is a similar phrase called conspiracy of silence, where a group of people, either civil society, either the clergy, either the media, through an unspoken agreement, just simply decides to keep quiet. Why? Because of fear of political reprisal or discrimination or victimization or they just simply have an interest in a matter, and so they keep quiet. That's a broad definition of culture of silence. He says we are seeing that. Is it true to suggest this? If this is true, then there may be possibly, even amongst the media, there is this unwritten code of silence. We are not as critical of the government anymore, even among civil society, even among academia, right? Is that what we have? Are people not talking because they fear that somebody's going to come for them, even if there's not a knock on the door, as the president suggests? We're going to get into that tonight. Fascinating conversation. Stay with us. Also, he says people speak on issues based on who is in power. Is that what it is? That there's a group of people, say civil society, for example, that when the NDC is in power, they are very vocal. When the NDC exits, they become pretty silent. Is that what he's talking about? Is that an example that we can cite on this? He says it's a deafening silence, suggesting that we are no longer concerned about issues that we complained about. Exactly what I was talking about, what the definition of the culture of silence is, or the conspiracy of silence. Well, is it true? We'll talk about that very shortly. Now, there is a very interesting dynamic in this whole conversation that Samuel Okudzeto-Ablakwa, the MP for North Tongue, also introduces. And the research desk put this graph together for me just to illustrate it. Okudzeto-Ablakwa describes a two-stage wave of the culture of silence. The first wave, he says, is during the PNDC era. And then he says the second wave is under the presidency of Akufo-Addo. Two waves, he says, that in the last, 30 years, we've seen two waves. Is this really true? We'll talk about that. This is his argument here as he explains what these waves are, right? So tonight we have to ask the question, is this all perceived or real? The president has spoken about this. You should find his speech and listen to it. Very fascinating speech, but let's dissect it a bit more. We've heard the two contrasting views. What is it? Do we really have a culture of silence? Stay with me.
In my political career over the years, I've been at the receiving end of much vitriol and deliberate falsehood thrown at me to cause maximum damage to my reputation and my political prospects. I know what it is like to be unable to protect members of your family from the mud aimed at you, but which splashes on them as well. I'm not alone in this. And there are unfortunately several journalists that have been willing to lend themselves to the destruction of people's reputations and livelihoods without just cause. Not all journalists are upright citizens, just as politicians, painters, and farmers are not all upright citizens. But I do expect our institutions to deal fairly and equitably with all citizens according to the dictates of the law when people go wrong. Let me end by addressing a particular line of the current argument being made about the threat to rights and freedoms. I believe this has led to a new definition of a culture of silence. It goes along the line. That when people in government and all government policies are criticized, and there is a defense of the people of policies, it is intimidatory and leads to a culture of silence. A radio station is currently running a campaign against free SHS. During the last election, I got the clear impression free SHS had been endorsed by all political parties, and all we needed to do was to keep improving it. Would a spirited defense of the free SHS policy constitute an attack on press freedom? I wonder. It cannot be that everyone has a right of reply except members of the government and officialdom. Nor can it be The challenging an opinion expressed by a journalist constitutes an attack on press freedom. What I believe may be sorely lacking in our society today is the need to listen to each other more. Knowledge has never been a gift granted exclusively to one group. We must listen.
And thank you for staying with us here on PM Express. My guest joining me tonight is my own prof, Professor Audrey Gajekpo. He is Associate Professor, Department of Communication Studies and Dean, School of Information and Communication Studies at the University of Ghana. Prof, thank you for agreeing to speak to me here on PM Express.
Thank you for having me on.
Great.
And good to see you.
Good to see you again, Prof. Also with me is Philip Osebunsu, my colleague, Programs Manager at Asempa FM and host of Ekusi Sang. We'll be joined shortly by Suleiman Abrahima. He is Executive Director of the Media Foundation for West Africa. Prof, I mean, we've had all the sides of this. Is there a culture of silence? Is it real or perceived?
Perceived.
Okay.
And let me tell you, I totally disagree with the notion of a culture of silence, because one of the best quotes I had when I was discussing it with somebody was a person said, if speech leads to more speech on an issue, how can it be a culture of silence? In other words, here we are on a show like yours, debating and arguing about a culture of silence, based on what government has done, what government has not done, what a critic has said, what a critic has not said. It cannot be a culture of silence. I, on the other hand, think that indeed there are cultures of silences in which a lot of Ghanaians are complicit, including the media. Certain things that the media will not talk about, and it's not just politics. You see, we live in a democracy, and so we should have spaces and opportunities to debate uncomfortable questions. I think that we must be concerned if we think that our politicians are trying to stifle free speech, but I'm not convinced that they are, although there are some incidents that may tend to have a chilling effect. I don't think that our politicians are deliberately trying to stifle free speech. They still engage with the media and they still largely respect media rights, even though there are infractions, and I'm the first to talk about the infractions. But I do think that we live in a society where people don't like to stick their necks out for fear of reprisals. And it's not just political reprisals, but social reprisals. And therefore, there are powerful groups, again, not just the politicians, but other powerful groups that we do not critique robustly enough. I have the churches in mind. I also have the silences. And I know I'm going to be very controversial, but the silences in the media about other people's rights, like the rights of LGBTQ communities, where the media just refuses to give them space to articulate alternate views. So I think that largely we tend to have problems with non-dominant views. But I don't think we live in this culture of silence as we understood it during PNDC times. And I can't help but be a little bit offended with that graph because it's a political ploy. I don't think I want, you see, that's my problem with the media. Do your independent research and come and show me a graph. Don't show me a graph by an opposition politician comparing PNDC with the, today. And the last thing I want to say is that actually it will be very difficult because of the media terrain to have a true culture of silence. Why do I say that? We have a lot of media houses right now. In the PNDC times, we were de facto state media country. No newspapers, but certainly all the electronic media was under state control. So there was very little alternate voices. Today we have a lot of alternate voices, and we have the powerful tool of social media. And you should only go on social media, I get it on my WhatsApp, where people actually are robustly criticizing, in fact, calling out the president, calling out politicians, insulting them, using all manner of things, you know? And I think that that's just the nature of the beast. And for those reasons, I don't think you can characterize us as being in a culture of silence.
Okay. Let me bring in Philip, who's a practicing journalist. He sort of mediates between the citizens, the public, and the power holders. Obi, is there a culture of silence? Is the culture of silence perceived or real?
Evans, thanks for having me. Let me say good evening to your viewers. And greetings to Prof. I've been following her for quite a while, so it's a privilege to be on the same panel with her. But let me add, and I tend to largely agree with Prof, that maybe it's perceived, but for me it also depends on what culture of silence is. And what I've realized is that there have been different, definitions of what culture of silence is. So depending on who is speaking, the answer might be yes or no. I had a discussion with Prof. Stephen Kweku Asare, and he gave quite an interesting definition of what culture of silence is. And I think you alluded to that in your introduction, Evans, that culture of silence can be described as the behavior of a group of people of some size, as large as an entire national group or profession, or as small as a group of colleagues, that by an unspoken consensus do not mention, discuss, or acknowledge a given subject. So he believes this should be the standard definition of what culture of silence is. And I think it dovetails into the definition or what Dr. Sam Jonah alluded to earlier in the interesting write-up he put out. But let me also say that based on this definition, I would say, yes, you would find people talking, but there can still be a culture of silence, depending on people's interests, depending on people's beliefs, depending on where people stand on a subject or the other. So people will choose which subjects to comment on. So yes, there might be a lot more people talking, people engaging on social media, people speaking in the traditional media, but you would find, still a culture of silence dominating in the system. And you remember that Dr. Sam Jonah drew a distinction, and he believed that the culture of silence is that we sometimes say certain things or do not say certain things depending on convenience, parochialism, hypocrisy, or lack of conviction. So I would not say that generally there is a culture of silence, but depending on which topic is at stake, you would find people speaking or not speaking.
Okay, but very interesting. I want to play the president. He defines what he believes to be a redefinition of the culture of silence in this is really a seminal speech, really. And then let's see if you all agree with what he says. This is the president speaking just 48 hours ago in Cape Coast.
In my political career over the years, I've been at the receiving end of much vitriol and deliberate falsehood thrown at me to cause maximum damage to my reputation and my political prospects. I know what it is like to be unable to protect members of your family from the mud aimed at you, but which splashes on them as well. I'm not alone in this. And there are unfortunately several journalists that have been willing to lend themselves to the destruction of people's reputations and livelihoods without just cause. Not all journalists are upright citizens, just as politicians painters and farmers are not all upright citizens. But I do expect our institutions to deal fairly and equitably with all citizens according to the dictates of the law when people go wrong. Let me end by addressing a particular line of the current argument being made about the threat to rights and freedoms. I believe this has led to a new definition of a culture of silence. It goes along the line. That when people in government and all government policies are criticized, and there is a defense of the people of policies, it is intimidatory and leads to a culture of silence. A radio station is currently running a campaign against free SHS. During the last election, I got the clear impression free SHS had been endorsed by all political parties, and all we needed to do was to keep improving it. Would a spirited defense of the free SHS policy constitute an attack on press freedom? I wonder. It cannot be that everyone has a right of reply except members of the government and officialdom. Nor can it be that challenging an opinion expressed by a journalist constitutes an attack on press freedom. What I believe may be sorely lacking in our society today is the need to listen to each other more. Knowledge has never been a gift granted exclusively to one group. We must listen and hear each other more. And for me personally, I find it ironic that the presidency of a man who has been and continues to be daily the most vilified political figure of his generation can be accused of presiding over a culture of silence. There's no midnight knock on the door in Ghana for authors of dissenting views, nor will there be during my presidency.
So that is the president speaking over the weekend. Prof, let me ask you, do you agree with the president when he says there is a misunderstanding, a misdefinition of the culture of silence, as has been defined right now as, I'm quoting him, along the lines when people in government and all government policies are criticized, and there is a defense of the people of policies, it is intimidatory and leads to a culture of silence. That is what the president believes is the current definition of the culture of silence, almost suggesting currently there's a misunderstanding of what that is. You agree?
Well, I will take, I told you at the beginning of this discussion that I disagree that we were living in an era of a culture of silence, because I understand that era of a culture of silence that people have in mind as a very different scenario. So I don't want to restate that point. I think that I sense a certain frustration from the president's speech that sometimes when politicians push back at criticism robustly, they're seen as silencing, silencing dissent. And he thinks that that's unfair because if you are criticized, you have a right to defend yourself, you have a right to come back. What you don't have a right to do, and I think that in the president's speech he affirms is to attack people in the middle of, go pick up people in the middle of the night, and those things which we associated with the culture of silence. And I think he's largely right on that. I do think, however, though, that there is a perception that there's a price to pay if you do not, if you are too overtly critical of government. And it's not just media people who pay the price, I imagine. It's people who have certain aspirations, people who work in certain places. But I do think that that sort of instinct has always been there. People are very careful about what they say in public because they don't want to pay a price for speaking out. They don't want to pay the price. And I think that in every society, there is a price for speaking out. We are in institutions, and when people speak out in institutions, why do you think we have whistleblower laws? You know, when people speak out in corporations, including Mr. Sam Jonah's corporation, there are all these cultures of silences that can spring up, and we need to encourage people to speak up more, to take the steps to make sure. So I find it very reassuring that the president in his speech is reassuring Ghanaians of the government's commitment to press freedoms. And we can hold him to that.
Okay, I mean, I'll come to the subtleties though of this. So he talks about the knock on your door, which is very overt, which is seen. You see it as a threat. But what about, I've spoken to people who say that it's a more sinister, subtle, I guess, targeting of you in the shadows that you feel that then makes you quiet subsequently. We'll address that shortly. But Obi, kind of give me a quick reaction to when you listen to the president. I know you've listened to him. What was your reaction when you heard him?
Yeah, I think the distinction he sought to draw, you know, between what pertained in times past, especially pre-constitutional rule, so before 1992, where we had attacks on press houses, where he used that metaphorical thing about a knock on the door. So it for me, it tells me that in times past, I mean, what one said or did not say was driven by, say, the gun or the force of a gun, because we're under military rule. I don't think that is the situation now. But of course, as journalists, we might not have the same or similar experiences. I mean, journalist A will tell you based on his experiences, he is not free to go about his work and all of that. Journalist B would have a different opinion. So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. I think depending on the journalist's own experiences, he would either say he's being targeted, he's not being targeted, and all of that. But largely, I agree with Prof that it might not be factual also to say that generally there is a culture of silence. I think we are coming from a cultural background where we are told to respect authority. So even in our workplaces, I mean, hardly would you find people talking back to their managers, people talking back to people in authority and all of that. So as a country, maybe we should begin to have a broader conversation around how we can inculcate that spirit of assertiveness in people, where people can assert themselves, where people can speak up when they feel they need to and all of that. I don't see that as part of our cultural makeup. You are either told you're arrogant, you are disrespectful, and all of that. So that cultural conversation should be had, and that we should raise a new generation of people who are assertive, who can state a position and vigorously defend, say. I think that is a bit lacking. And it also feeds into this whole thing about a culture of silence, which I think is only perceived by not real.
Okay, Obi, let me stay with you on this. In the clip I play, the president says something that also highlights, maybe some may say, one of the issues. Yeah. He characterizes a radio station, and he says the radio station is currently running a campaign against free SHS. And we all know he was talking about Joy FM, because last week they did a series on free SHS. Yeah. It is that, first of all, was he characterizing it properly when he says a campaign against? And you on radio, so you know this. Yeah. And then he says, well, if there's a spirited defense. So it's the way you characterize it that defines your response. Mm-hmm. He is characterized it as a campaign against, right? And so he says the appropriate response could possibly be a spirited defense. And will that be a culture of silence? Do you get a sense that sometimes politicians, and then this may not necessarily be to his government alone, but generally, that they misread what the press does, or there's a certain, I don't know, deliberate misunderstanding of the role the press is playing, immediately in getting feedback for them, and so that then sometimes inspires a sort of, some may describe as overhanded, high-handed reaction from the government towards the press, and that people may read into that and they say you're being too harsh.
And I think from the entire speech I heard, and that bit was my only disappointment, and his speech writers should probably look at that again, so that when he's given another opportunity, he might not repeat same. Because point is, I mean, there are arguments about whether the platform was the appropriate platform to hit back at the media and all of that. We can get into that discussion. But largely, I think people, and you're right, Evans, in saying that sometimes people misread what we do and the intention behind saying. I'll take you to the 1992 Constitution, chapter 12, which is dedicated to the freedom and independence of the media. And when you read 162 clause 4, so it says, editors and publishers of newspapers and other institutions of the mass media shall not be subject to control or interference by government, nor shall they be penalized or harassed for their editorial opinions and views or the content of their publication. The 6 says, no, I think the 5 says, all agencies of the mass media shall at all times be free to uphold the principles, provisions, and objectives of this Constitution, and shall uphold the responsibility and accountability of the government to the people of Ghana. And this is fundamental. And I think it's something we should probably read time without number for people to appreciate the onerous responsibility on us as media people. And that, because let's face it, I mean, and as the president rightly alluded to, that there was a bipartisan consensus that free status is a good thing. I mean, we have dependents, we have people we pay school fees for, and all of that. We are not doing same now. So some of us will be the last people to speak against free SHS as a policy. But it doesn't also mean that if we identify some challenges with it, I mean, that is our responsibility as media people. And the intention is not to denigrate the policy, to more like make the policy unpopular or anything of that sort. It's our role to make sure that we build this policy and make it better and make it stronger and make it work and work well. So I think people should understand the media from that angle. Of course, when you do any story, say about Free Senior High School, the Constitution is clear that any medium for the dissemination of information to the public which publishes a statement about or against any person shall be obliged to publish a rejoinder, if any, from the person in respect of whom the publication was made. And I think even if you take Joy FM, you take my show, for example, we gave the opportunity to the GES, the Ministry of Education, and they were on the show to also state their side of the story. And I think once we have those engagements, it's all for the betterment of our country. So it was erroneous to look at the work of the media as a campaign against Free Senior High School. I don't think that was the intention of my colleagues on Joy FM, of my colleagues on Ecosystems, for example, because we had a clear intention. This is a good policy. We think we should highlight the positives and the negatives, so we make it work and work and work better. I mean, so that was unfortunate. I think it was avoidable, honestly.
Prof, what's your comment on that? Do you think that? Yes, Prof.
Yes, I was intrigued when you said, obviously, he was talking about Joy FM or Joy, because I had no idea which media house he was talking about.
Yes, it was. It was Joy FM.
I had no idea whatsoever.
It was Joy FM.
And so, as a journalism teacher, I would ask you, how do you know he was referring to you? How do you know?
Can I answer that question?
Call you by name?
No, he didn't. But you know what you taught me in school.
Do you think you're the only media house that's been running a campaign, or do you think you're running a campaign against senior high school?
Good question.
SHS, sorry.
Good
you think you're running a campaign against
No, good.
And might there be somebody else who is running a campaign against?
No, good question.
I'm just playing devil's advocate.
I know,
That's
good
my
question.
role.
And I actually have an answer to that. I remember when you taught me interviewing in school, you said when you're interviewing, an interviewer asks the question, don't answer. But I'll answer this one. I mean, the thing about this, though, it came at the end of the week where Joy FM morning show had done a series on free SHS. And the education minister had earlier on been on another network in the evening and had accused us of running a campaign against them. And in the end, of course, we got the minister into the studio on Friday at the end of the series to respond to it. But there was a sense in government, and they called to complain. And the minister went on TV to actually accuse us of running down free SHS. And then the weekend, the minister is sitting beside the president, and the president is standing saying, there is a media house who is currently running a campaign. You just have to, you know who he's talking about.
Okay, I'm glad you cleared it up for me and for your listeners. So we have a context and we understand that there's a reason why you think the president was talking about you. And I think that's very important in journalism. People will be sitting back there and saying, why do they think it was them? They didn't call them by name.
You're right.
But having said that, I agree with Philip. A lot of what Philip said, that, the Constitution is clear as to protecting journalistic rights, the media's rights. I mean, there's a whole chapter devoted to that. Because there's a recognition that if we don't have a robust media, we will not have a robust democracy. And I think that is very important for people to appreciate that. I think it's also important for the media themselves to appreciate that, so that they do their work with a lot more courage, but also with a lot more professionalism and factfulness, so that they won't be caught out. I think that the politicians tend to be thin-skinned. So general rule, they tend to be thin-skinned because they are afraid that if they have, in quotes, bad publicity, it will undermine their chances of re-election and all of that. And so they tend to overreact. And I think it's unfortunate. I also think that part of the adversarial relationship that the media, a good watchdog media, will always have is them sparring with their detractors, with their political opponents. Well, they're not opponents, with the political opponents, because they're on the other side, but really with the politicians who don't want to be criticized but need to be criticized. So I also think it's important that the media becomes thick-skinned. The media has to not always overreact when politicians criticize them. They should understand that it's par for the course. They should understand where the politicians are coming from. They don't have to like first. The politicians don't have to like what the media says, but both the politicians and the media have to live with one another, respecting each other's roles as such, and giving each other the space. I like the fact that you said that you invited the minister into your studios, to engage him on the issue. I want to believe, and I didn't see the show, that at the end of the show, there was an understanding of where you were coming from. Because it is good, and this is especially important for politicians to hear, that it is good to use the media to get feedback, no matter how uncomfortable that feedback is. Because it's only through the media feedback that you'll be able to have a certain pulse on what is being said in society, being said amongst your constituents, in order for you to self-correct. I think, though, that having said all that, we still cannot define ourselves as living in a culture of silence, because that implies something else. However, and that's the last thing I'll say, that there is a certain element of self-censorship that can come when journalists feel under siege from people that they consider as powerful. There is, and that we need to guard against.
Yeah, I mean,
we don't want journalists to self-censor.
Yeah.
And it will, and the way to safeguard against that is not necessarily to stop politicians from criticizing the media, because they will, but it's to be sure that the media houses themselves encourage, defend, have safeguards in place to protect their journalists who speak out. One of the things that Jonah said, and I agree with, is that there are too many politicians who own media. And therefore, you see that proprietorial influence in content. And you see a certain tendency of the media to be polarized because of their political persuasion. In all democracies, having said that, there's always room for partisan media. You know, the partisan newspapers, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, I think the danger is what percentage of our media becomes partisan, particularly those that purport to be mainstream and yet have hidden political hands behind them. And that's the danger.
Okay. I mean, to that last point you made about self-censorship, I'll return to after this break, because we talk about the overt culture of silence. What about the covert culture of silence, if there's anything like that? This self-censorship, this thinking twice before you talk. I know there's a cultural thing, but is there an intensification of this in civil society, in clergy, in academia, in among the media, for example, when you put it against, say, the raid on City FM, the killing of Ahmed Swali, although there is no direct governmental involvement in that particular instance, does that all combined send a certain signal to people that, listen, you have to check what you do? And how is this perception, if it exists, affecting critical media? I mean, I wonder what Prof's own reading of the media landscape is. Are we having the death of critical media compared to what it used to be in the past? Stay with me after this break. And thank you for staying with us. We're having this very fascinating conversation about the culture of silence, whether it's perceived or real. On the back of this seminal speech by the president over the weekend, where he lays out his own views on the matter, because he had been accused of superintending over this culture of silence. I must point out that the man who put this front and center is Mrs. Jonah, who was seated right beside him, by the way, when he delivered that speech. So that puts it in proper context. And of course, some may say, well, if the man who criticized him for that is sitting beside him whilst he also had his say, isn't that an illustration of an absence of a culture of silence? Well, you can read into that as you may. But my guests have been Professor Audrey Gajepo and my colleague Obi, who is a practitioner himself. But Prof, I want to come to you on this. I want to come to the media side of things. I know, the culture of silence is broad; it covers all, academia. But I want to focus on the media for a second. There's a view out there that the media currently is not as critical as it used to be, and it has become a pretty more less critical in the last 5 years. In fact, some have gone ahead to describe it as the death of critical media. You've been in this game for so long, and I know you monitor. Do you have that same sense? You share that view?
I think people like to swing and be too, extreme in these views. I think that we would like to see more critical media. It is true. But I think that there are some media organizations doing good journalism. There are also outlets doing good journalism, doing critical journalism, like Fourth Estate and people like that, because our democracy has room for all of these things. Having said that, though, I do think that we need more investment. So we come back to those who invest in media. And that's always been my problem, is that people set up media organizations, but they don't invest in making sure that the human resources have what it takes to do the kind of critical journalism that you're talking about, Evans. How many media houses have resources for investigative journalism? How many? Even sometimes the basic equipment that journalists need to do their work, and you more than myself knows what's going on in the newsrooms. Perhaps not yours, but in many other newsrooms. Even those resources are not there. I know, because I do training for journalists all the time, that very few media houses train their own journalists. They wait until maybe the GJ has some donor or somebody to help train. But those are investments. You can't have critical media, you can't have critical journalism if you don't invest in it. You have to invest in even hiring some of the best brains to have critical journalism and paying them and retaining them, not giving them bad conditions of service so that they don't stay. They look for other jobs, even the best and the brightest. And for me, most importantly, also making sure that they can do their work in safety. Because even though I disagree that there is a culture of silence, because that's just too broad and embracing and putting it on a political doorstep, which I disagree with, I do also think that there's a certain environment that is making it unsafe to practice journalism, and security services are some of the perpetrators. So in that sense, you can say the state is making journalism practice unsafe. But it's not just the state also, it's other actors. So we've seen individuals attack journalists. We've seen even people belonging to church groups attack journalists, etc., etc. So there's a certain environment that still persists, where journalists are not always safe. And I'm not sure, I think these days, better than in the past, I'm not sure that the media houses have always done what they should be doing to protect the journalists. So I lay the problem at the doorstep, more at the doorsteps of the media organizations rather than external forces in that sense, if you're talking about critical journalism. And like I said,
But sorry, I just wanted to run that by Obi. Obi, are we less critical now than before? And do you agree with Prof that we should take the lion's share of the blame here, if indeed it's true that we are less critical now? Obi, kindly unmute your Zoom for me. Yes.
Sorry about that. I don't think we are less critical. What I think has happened is that there seemed to be an evolution, in our country relative to the various media available to the Ghanaian people. I mean, hitherto, you would find the work of journalism, as some kind of a reserve for a selected few, people who worked in media houses, who worked for newspapers, who were very good writers, who were very good orators, and all of that. But now social media changes that dynamic. So every individual with a social media account is some kind of a citizen journalist. So you go onto social media, people are questioning authority, people are raising issues. And what we've done even now is to lift a lot of the issues from social media onto traditional media. So it tells you that people are becoming a bit more aware, people are beginning to question authority, people are raising issues on their own without even journalists having to do a lot of those. But even that, practicing journalists also take on the system. Evans, I can count the number of very good, solid interviews you've done on Newsnight, you've done on Top Story, and all of that, holding duty bearers accountable. We do same on Ekosi saying, our colleagues on other platforms do same. So I don't think there is that. I mean, for our investigative journalist colleagues, bringing some of the very, very good stories, taking the system on and all of that. There's always room for improvement, but I don't agree with anybody who says there is a death of journalism. What I think is happening is that the overconcentration on ratings has led some of our colleagues into being a bit irresponsible, which I think we should also look at. I saw a video, I think yesterday, and I don't know if you've seen it, of a colleague journalist sitting in a studio, wishing plane crash, wishing some people die, wishing their bodies will not be seen. I don't know if you've seen that video, Evans.
No, I haven't.
And I think that was now the height of irresponsibility.
Yeah.
It's not something we should encourage. And I think as media practitioners, we should also be bold to call out our colleagues when they get it wrong, and know that this is a learning process that we would learn every day through our experiences and all of that. And once we get to that level, we'll begin to improve, because we know that there's some kind of peer review amongst ourselves, and that constantly would see some improvement. Yes, Prof talks about training, Prof talks about, taking safety of journalists and all of that by our employers, so which is something we should all push for. And I'm happy also that the Information Ministry is doing something in that regard. Maybe we should take interest and make sure that thing works while we concentrate within on what we can do to protect ourselves. The state should also be interested. And that's why I think the president mentioning the murder of Ahmed Swale, and that he knows the police is interested in that. I think it's something, because of the president's record, it's something the president himself should be interested in. Because yes, he made a point touting his achievement, his record in that regard. This is something he should personally be interested in, to find out what happens in the case of Ahmed Swale. And it will reassure all of us that the state is interested in our safety, and that will be allowed, and given the room to do our work unhindered.
Obi and Prof, thank you very much for joining us on PM Express, and I'm pretty sure this is a conversation, a lot of food for thought there, as people think about what the culture of silence is and its current manifestations, if there is any. You've heard, you can all make up your own mind today. Enjoy the rest of your evening.